Linked in the description is some gameplay of me using this very oddly constructed Ruby Sapphire deck. I wanted to essentially break away from the established norm of what I call ramp to remove, which is the traditional way that Ruby Sapphire is built, heavy on uninkables, kind of aggressively ramping to get to your top end threats. And I've opted for more of a curved out tempo oriented build, if you will. And in this video, I'm going to explain this deck profile and some of the card choices and theories behind what our goals were with this deck. I did play a couple more matches and I think there is room to improve on this deck. I don't think like Gramatalas may be needed, but I can explain why we opted to include them. And so we'll kind of go over that as we move through the video. Before I get started though, I will say that these deck profiles, I usually release them early for YouTube members. So if you want to become a member of the channel, you can support us by subscribing through the join button. It's $2.99 a month or through Patreon for $2.50. Again, you don't have to. These do become public after a day or two, but there's just a little nice additional bonus for those who opt to financially support the channel. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump straight in. On the one curve, we are playing only items. It's a total of 8 Sapphire items, and it's the Ice Block and Popsicle. One of the things that really solidified Ruby Sapphire as an ink pairing, in my opinion, is the release of Ice Block along with the 2 new Sisus. Well, honestly, all 3, but these 2 are really good. The Empowered Sibling as a board wipe and the Daring Visitor. The Ice Block makes this card way better than it usually would be in any other ink pairing, in my opinion, because the 2 and 3 strength characters in this game are like widespread. You can see here, even in our deck, until we get past 5, like everything is 2 or less, basically, right? Or 3 or less. And so just having 1 or 2 ice blocks in play instantly turns this Sisu into a massive trade up, and this card can generate you a ton of advantage and or claw back a lot of advantage. This card can take out things like the Diablos. If you ice block it down, it can take down Ursula Deceiver of all. It can take out just like a number of really relevant threats that you want to get out of rotation. We clicked off the deck there, but here we are back on it. And of course we play 4 Popsicles. So this deck, not really too heavy on items. It's only 12 items. The Popsicle is just tremendous value, and the Ice Block, in my opinion, is just like a really good option for Ruby Sapphire. Not only that, you know, it turns on your Brawl for a lot of characters as well, reducing 3 strength or 4 strength characters down to 2, and it makes your Madame Medusa go that much further, solidifying it as a meta relevant staple. So that is our 1-drops, just the items. You're not really going to be looking to establish a character, but where this deck really starts to separate itself from the traditional builds of Ruby Sapphire is where is on the 2 and 3 drop curve. So on the 2-drop curve, we play only a total of 8 cards again, both of them characters, 4 Flynn Rider Frenemy and 4 Lumiere. I really do like the design of this card. I think this card does a lot for Ruby, and the reason I've opted to include this in the Ruby Sapphire deck is because what does Ruby Sapphire traditionally suffer with? Aggro, mainly Emerald aggro decks, right? Those decks play very low to the ground. They often play very low strength characters, which again, furthers the point of why Sisu is so good too. But because of Flynn Rider, if you establish this on turn 2, if they don't have a 2-drop character that they can put on turn 3 or their own turn 2, you're going to gain 3 lore. This instantly allows you to keep up with the aggro decks in terms of lore gain. If on turn 3 you drop Lumiere, your Flynn Rider becomes a 3/2 body. Now they need a 3 strength or more character to stop you from getting that 3 lore. And they usually don't have any forms of early interaction. I don't know why it keeps doing that, but anyways, Emerald aggro decks usually don't have any form of early interaction in order to out this Flynn Rider. If they're on Emerald Steel, they have to either like hard cast, if they're on the draw, they have to hard cast Let a Storm Rage on, Strength of a Raging Fire, or something along those lines in order to out this. If you watch that gameplay video where we were up against an Amber Steel player, they had to go like to extreme lengths to try to play around Flynn Rider. They had to like double Tinkerbell. They had to play a Cinderella in an awkward position. Like it forced them into very awkward plays, but slowed down their potential ability to like establish board presence because they had to counter the 3 lore gain from the Flynn Rider. It's that significant. And so in the early game, this card represents both lore gain and a good option to trade out if needed into opposing characters. So it gives you a little bit more stabilization against the aggro decks and in the early game. Against certain matchups, yes, this card is going to be underwhelming. Like in the mirror match, this could get ice blocked down and Sisu'd away. It does get pinged off by things like Baboom, Let the Storm Rage on, like I mentioned, a Grab Your Swords that will come later on potentially. So it's not necessarily invincible, but into the aggro matchups, it is a lot better than I thought it would be, and I really do like this card. The Lumiere, like I said, it just helps synergize well with the deck by giving all your characters +1 strength. It makes something like your Goofy, Super Goof as a 3/4 body much more relevant into the meta. Not only is this card going to be gaining lore on challenging, so you can kind of see non-questing sources of lore that we're getting very early on in the game compared to something like a Lucky Dime that would close out the game for Ruby Sapphire traditionally. We're able to kind of gain that lore, and the Lumiere supports those things, as well as boosting up your field so that if you do have a Flynn Rider, it just makes it that much harder for your opponent to play around it by putting a high strength character on board. Like, they need to out the Lumiere, they need to out the Flynn Rider, and like I said, they have to make very awkward plays in order to try to do that. And then if they do make those awkward plays, it passes back to you, then you're able to establish your game plan. Because the Flynn Rider just being on board is kind of like a location, right? It's like it's sitting there. It's not really threatening to like do stuff to your board, but like the fact that it's generating passively 3 lore, your opponent basically has to beat it. They have to either outplay it by putting that higher strength character on board or equal strength character, or just out it entirely, right? So it is a good option for that. And furthering to that point, I've already explained why Sisu Daring Visitor is good, but your other 3-drop character in Sisu Emboldened Warrior is just incredible. If you curve out with Flynn Rider into Sisu or Flynn Rider into Lumiere, this card coming down on turn 3, especially against aggro decks, might be a 4/4 body, might be a 5/4 body. There's almost nothing opposing decks are going to put on board on turn 3 or turn 4 that's going to really rival this if it's a 4/4 body or 5/4 body. And people will usually aggressively dump their hand, and again, forcing them into awkward plays in order to get this card down to a 1/4 or a 2/4, just to mitigate things like you getting that passive lore gain from the Flynn Rider. Not only that, this card having that 4 toughness allows it to trade into aggro threats without you losing this body. And then if you don't end up challenging stuff, it's just a 2-quester anyway, so it's very strong. Now, in combination with this Sisu here, between both of these, that's 7 low drop Sisus, like 7 3-cost Sisus that act as shift material for the big Sisu, meaning that this card is much more viable in order to be played early to wipe the board, further stabilizing aggro matchups. And even in the mirror matches, you can see here, there's a lot of 2 strength or less characters, especially with Ice Block established. You can, further reduce things. This card acts as a very effective board wipe, especially in the early to mid game. Well, I guess you really wouldn't play this until the mid game. So that's kind of the 3-curve package. In addition to that, we can go down and look at Brawl, another card, like I said, that gets additional utility off of Ice Block. But this card, in my opinion, has really done a lot for Ruby. Just being able to deal with a lot of the early and even mid game threats is incredible. Using this card, for example, in my Amber Ruby deck, if you watch those videos, you've seen how much value we've gotten off of the Brawl, taking out Diablos and Ursula Deceivers of All. Those are the main targets. So this card is a really good addition for Ruby and really propels it up in terms of its playability, the entire ink color in Ruby. We also play this card, which I know a lot of people are going to look at it and be like, what? No Fishbone Quill? What is Great Stone Dragon doing instead? And I think I was calling this Guardian Dragonstone in my gameplay video. So yeah, small correction there, or big correction, and it's called Great Stone Dragon. It's a new card from Ursula's Return. It enters play exerted, so if you do end up playing this on 3 instead of a character, for example, you can't use it right away. And then the next turn, you can exert it and put a character from your discard into your inkwell face down and exert it. So this card is extremely, extremely slow. It is not by any means a replacement for Fishbone Quill. Like Fishbone Quill, you play, you ink from your hand. The ink that you play from your hand is available to be used right away. And then, later on, for different turns, if you double ink with Fishbone Quill, like you could be on like 5 or 6 ink, and they're all usable right away, right? If you play Fishbone Quill on turn 3. Whereas this card doesn't really do that. So why would you opt to play this instead of a Fishbone Quill? Well, like I said, instead of doing the whole ramp to remove strategy that traditionally you've seen Ruby Sapphire decks doing, they don't really have any character interaction really until like turn 5-6, right? Like, yeah, they might play this Sisu, it's a 1/1 body, they use it as removal, they don't play Goofies, they might play Gramatalas or Hurums, but those are just like further characters to establish, scrying or drawing to get into your top end threats, but they don't really play any low to the ground packages that will enable you to stabilize against aggro decks. So if the aggro player comes out swinging hard, and especially on the play, and they establish a board of like 3 or 4 characters and they're questing for like 6, by the time you get up here, it might be a little too late, right? Like your Maui isn't as impactful, your Madame Medusa as a single removal isn't as impactful. You really need like the Sisu or Be Prepared board wipe in order to stabilize against those aggro decks. Whereas this deck can definitely hold its own a little bit stronger, since I don't think normally Ruby Sapphire plays this Sisu, but this card in combination with these other lower drops and even the Goofy now help you deal with the board states in the early and mid games. So because of that, you can passively use this item to just get free advantage, because unlike Fishbone Quill, it's not taking from your hand, it's taking from your discard pile. As the ink gets put in exerted, that's fine, you don't need to use it right away, because again, you're playing more of a tempo oriented deck where each turn you're looking to establish a single threat. It's not until maybe you've used this 2 or 3 times where you really start to see the advantage, and now you can start playing multiple interactions in a turn or drop your big game threats later on. If you play this on turn 3 or 4, you're likely seeing the benefits on turn 6 maybe and turn 7, where at that point you can start dropping these bigger threats a turn or 2 early and further solidify the board state, right? So that's kind of the game plan with it. And like I said, this card just represents free advantage. You're not losing cards from your hand. You don't have to worry about, you know, I'm losing cards that I'm going to need to play, because that's the worst thing, right? It's like I have cards in my hand, I want to play them. If I ink them, I can't play them. And that's one of the things I really didn't like about Ruby Sapphire. Again, I know it's a very effective deck, but like if you were playing these Sisus and these Madame Medusas and they bricked up your hand, and you had a bunch of other uninkables, because, you know, that deck plays 20 to 24 uninkables, which is another thing I didn't like. And then you're like, well, I'll just Fishbone Quill them. I can play a ton of uninkables because I'll just Fishbone them. I don't really want to be Fishbone Quilling my Madame Medusa. I want to be playing it and getting the value off of it, right? I want to be playing my Sisu and getting the value off of it. And so this deck allows you to keep these threats, and being on such low uninkable count on only 13, you're likely not going to be bricked up too often with these cards, and therefore you are able to play them out and get the utility off of them. Cards that you mainly look to ink depending are like multiple copies of Flynn, Lumiere, Sisu, Grammatala, probably not Hiram, but in certain situations, yes, the Mauis, and then the Tamatoa and Maleficent, even, because these are far away until you get to the top end where you actually want to use them. Like I mentioned, the Grammatala may not be needed, but at worst she's just ink anyways. But she does represent free lore when you can ink for turn and ink off of the Great Stone Dragon, especially if you have 2 of these in play. She can generate a lot of lore quickly. She's a big body in 4/8, and she does quest for 2. But again, probably not necessarily needed. You could maybe opt that out for a more effective card in the deck, let's say. But overall, I'm not too unsatisfied. I think this deck is fairly well constructed for the most part, but again, until you take it in to the games and test it, I mean, we need a lot of testing to find out if a deck is actually good or not. So, but this is the theory behind the deck. Moving on to the 4-drop slot, the Goofy Super Goof, I've only opted for 3 copies. You may want to go to 4 copies and maybe 3 copies of Grammatala if you end up cutting the 7-drop Grammatala. The only reason I'm playing more copies of this is because of the shift potential. And it does scry. It's a 4-body, 3/3 quest for 1. It's not a bad card to establish if you don't have a Goofy. If you don't have a Hiram, or you don't need to play the Goofy if there's not an immediate threat that you need to take out. So, you know, your four cost curve is a little saturated, you know, in a total of 12 or 11 cards, sorry, in 3 Goofies and 4 Hirams and 4 Grammatalas. So Hiram, I don't need to explain, you know, this is your draw engine. A very good card overall, obviously, and you definitely want to make sure you see this. But if you don't see it, again, it's not necessarily the end of the world, because, again, you're curving out and you're looking to establish a pretty stabilized game plan on board. And when you do see the Hiram, hopefully it's able to net you a ton of advantage because you've established a lot of the items as you move along the game. In the 5-drop slot, we've got Maui. No explanation needed there. It's the only card we play. And then in the 6-drop slot, we play 3 Madame Medusa. Now, you could opt to play 4, but I didn't want to risk drawing multiple copies of these, especially into the early and mid-game, until I was able to really get the benefit off of this. Again, with the Ice Block, the Madame Medusa is just one of the best removal options in the game, especially for Ruby Sapphire. It can take out pretty much anything. Like I said, especially with the Ice Block. I've already explained the Grammatala. You may or may not need to play this. It definitely can come in clutch, but in certain scenarios, you're just like, I'd rather just play something else. So you may opt to remove this for something a little bit more focused on board control, because that's kind of what this deck is aiming for overall. And then in the 8-drop slot, we play 3 of the Sisu. Now, you will notice that there is no Be Prepared in this deck at all. In fact, there are no songs, no 1-jumps, no Be Prepared, nothing like that. And that really does help you play around Ursula Deceiver, the 2-drop card from Emerald. And the Sisu, like I said, with the ice blocks, will usually board wipe by the time you drop this. So it can be very effective for that reason. Whether you shift it, which, like I said, you have 7 shift targets, or just play it out raw if you are able to ramp a little bit ahead with the Great Stone Dragon, despite it being a little slow. Only 2 Tamatoa. I think I would like to play more, so maybe you cut these Grammas for more Tamatoas. Stronger top end, more ability to revive things like Ice Block if they're outed or banished with Hiram, and with Popsicles, of course. Tamatoa is just a tremendous value. It is literally one of the best Sapphire cards in the game, in my opinion. And then, of course, on the top end, we're also finishing it off with the big boss monster, Maleficent Dragon. You dropped this. There was a game where I dropped this with the Flynn Rider, and it was just like, yeah, you're definitely not playing anything over 7 strength. So this card is just generating 3 lore off of Flynn and then questing for 2 on top of that. Like, and the fact that you can get this out early, like on turn 7 or 8, let's say, with the Great Stone Dragon potentially, makes it even more impactful. So that's pretty much the deck and some of the choices and theory behind it. It does have a better aggro matchup. It does have a slightly worse steel matchup because obviously a lot of these cards, especially these 3 right here, Flynn Rider, Lumiere, and the Sisu Daring Visitor, are all easily outable by steel cards like Let the Storm Rage On and so on and so forth. Even things like Sisu and Goofy can get outed by an Ursula Deceiver of All singing a Let the Storm Rage On, so be aware of that. But overall, it's still much more effective than the traditional version of Ruby Sapphire, in my opinion. And again, what I like about this is that I'm not playing 20 to 24 uninkables. I'm on 13 uninkables. I'm not having a problem deciding what to ink in playing cards out that are actually impactful. I'm not kind of just sitting there with an open board state for the first couple of turns as I try to aggressively ramp and get to my top end. And then when you do get to your top end, it's the same. It's just like I control the board state, but I've also managed the mid game to a degree where I'm not going to get blown out by somebody top decking a goat to close out the game, right? So that was kind of the goal of this deck. Make it a little bit more playable, less bricky, a little bit more tempo oriented. Like I said, you have a little bit of a worse matchup into steel, but again, in that gameplay video, I go up against Amber Steel and show that you still have a good matchup. It's just not as good as it was before. It still does rely on the Hiram draw engine. Into the mirror match, I would say that this is maybe one of the weaker points. Again, it would depend on how quickly, if you're able to establish like your Flynn Rider and your early and mid game threats before your opponent turns on their removal. Holy cow, I'm clicking on things that are taking me places. But yeah, overall, you know, a pretty solid list altogether, in my opinion. Give it a try. Let me know what you would change. Yeah, I mean, overall, it just seems well-rounded. I haven't tested it enough to know what like really bad matchups it would have. I would think, like I said, the mirror match might be a little tough. It's really dependent upon who establishes their ramp and card draw first, and since that deck can ramp with Fishbone Quill, if they see their Hirams, they're likely going to be ahead because your deck is a little bit slower, but your top end is more or less the same. Because they play Lucky Dimes, like they could technically close out the game faster than you, and you don't have item removal. So that's probably one of the reasons why it's the worst matchup. You could opt to include Lucky Dimes in this build too, but you're not playing Bells, and you're not really dependent upon the Tamatoa being massive with only 12 items. So, you know, it is a consideration, but if you can aggro out early, like usually the Lucky Dime won't do enough to close the game out for them, because again, you have the removal options. Like if they have the Lucky Dime, they play Bell, they use the Dime on Bell, gain 5 lore, they're not questing with the Bell right away. You can usually just like Medusa or Ice Block down the Bell and take it out with the Sisu. I've done that before. So, you know, it depends on the state of the game. It depends on really who has the tempo advantage. And like I said, this deck built a little bit more to play on curve should give you that advantage. So in theory, you know, it seems like a well-rounded deck, but like I said, more testing is needed. Anyways, that's going to do it for the deck profile. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did like this video, a like would be appreciated. And let me know in the comment section what you think. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.